Forget the Hollywood glamour. Forget the polished spurs, the clean-shaven heroes, and the noble duels at high noon. The real American frontier wasn't won on the battlefield. It was negotiated, bartered, and bled for inside the four walls of the saloon. But what actually happened behind those iconic swinging doors when the cameras weren't rolling? Most of what you think you know is a lie. A sanitized, Technicolor version of a much darker, much filthier reality. Today, we're peeling back the layers of sawdust and the century-old grime to uncover the accounts they didn't put in the history books. We're talking about black market banks that held a town's entire wealth, rigged tables where you never had a chance, and poisonous rotgut whiskey that could blind a man before he finished his second glass. We are going deep into the shadows of the Old West to reveal the power players, the criminals, and the survivors of the most dangerous social hubs in human history. And fair warning, it's much more corrupt and far more lethal than you've been told. This is the uncensored history of the Wild West Saloon. Before we get into it, make sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss more real stories behind history's biggest myths. Now, let's get into what the Wild West was really like. Number 25. The Dead Man's Hand. The Death of a Legend. We begin with the most famous, most uncensored, and most brutal saloon death in history. In 1876, in Deadwood, South Dakota, Wild Bill Hickok sat down for a game of poker at Nuttall and Mann's Saloon Number 10. For the first time in his life, Bill violated his golden rule. He sat with his back to the door. Jack McCall, a drifter seeking revenge for a perceived loss at the tables the day before, walked quietly through the bat-wing doors. He didn't challenge Bill to a duel. He didn't say a word until he was inches away. He pulled his revolver and shouted, "Take that!" as he fired a bullet into the back of Hickok's head. The bullet passed through Bill's brain, exited through his cheek, and hit the man sitting across from him in the wrist. Hickok died instantly, his body slumping over the table. In his hands, he held the cards that would become the most famous omen in history, 2 aces and 2 eights, the dead man's hand. This wasn't a moment of glory. It was a cowardly, filthy, and sudden end to the greatest gunslinger the West had ever known. It serves as the ultimate uncensored truth. In the Wild West, no matter how fast you were, the saloon always won in the end. Number 24. Wild Bill Hickok, the 1871 chaos. Violence in the West was rarely clean. The 1871 shootout involving Wild Bill Hickok in Abilene is the perfect example of the horrific chaos of a saloon gunfight. Hickok was confronted by Phil Coe, a saloon owner. During the exchange, Hickok drew his pistols and shot Coe. But in the dim light and the clouds of black powder smoke, Hickok saw another man charging toward him with a drawn weapon. Acting on pure instinct and adrenaline, Bill spun and fired 2 shots into the man's chest. When the smoke cleared, Hickok realized he had just killed Mike Williams, his own deputy and best friend, who had been running to help him. Hickok was so traumatized by the event that he reportedly never fought in another gunfight for the rest of his life. This is the reality Hollywood leaves out. The hero often killed the wrong person in the dark. Number 23. Big Minnie, the woman who wouldn't break. The uncensored history of the West is full of people who defied gender norms out of pure necessity. One such figure was Big Minnie, a woman of legendary stature and strength who worked in a rough-and-tumble Colorado saloon. Minnie wasn't there to entertain, she was there to keep the peace. In one famous account, a drunk patron decided to show off by pulling his revolver and firing into the air, causing a panic. Before the man could fire a second shot, Minnie vaulted over the bar, tackled him to the ground, and proceeded to beat him unconscious with his own weapon. She then dragged him to the door and threw him into the mud. It is a stark reminder that the delicate women of Victorian fiction didn't exist in the saloons of the West, where only the strong survived. Number 22. Bartenders, the enforcers of the frontier. In the Old West, being a bartender wasn't about mixology. It was about combat. A bartender was the bouncer, the medic, and the warden all rolled into one. Because everyone in the room was likely armed and definitely intoxicated, the bartender lived in a state of constant tactical awareness. Most kept a bung starter, a heavy wooden mallet used for tapping kegs within reach, along with a double-barreled shotgun tucked under the bar. They were trained to spot trouble before it started and to end it with overwhelming force. Many bartenders from this era have recorded histories of surviving multiple gunshot wounds and stabbings. It was, quite literally, one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. Number 21. Belle Cora, the Queen of San Francisco. Belle Cora was perhaps the most powerful woman in 1850s San Francisco. She ran a high-end parlor house and saloon that was the playground for the city's elite. But her power was truly tested when her husband, Charles Cora, killed a U.S. Marshal in a dispute over a theater seat. The city's Vigilance Committee, a group of self-appointed executioners, seized Charles and prepared to lynch him. Belle didn't back down. She spent thousands of dollars hiring the best legal minds and attempted to bribe the entire committee. Even after Charles was hanged, Belle remained in the city, continuing to run her empire and proving that in the Wild West, a woman with enough gold and enough secrets could look the law in the eye and never blink. We're stripping away the Hollywood myth, from the lethal rotgut whiskey to the brutal power plays of the barroom. But I have to know, if you were standing at the bar in 1880, would you trust the man pouring your drink or the lawman standing next to you? Drop a comment below. I want to see who'd actually survive a night in the real Old West. Don't go anywhere. We are continuing with the power players of the frontier, including the hidden royalty of the barroom and the scandalous secrets of the West's most famous lawmen. Number 20. Women of the Empire, the real power players. We are often told that women in the West were either schoolmarms or victims. The truth is much more fascinating. Some of the most feared and respected crime bosses of the frontier were women who owned and operated saloon empires. These women were shrewd business tacticians. They didn't just run bars, they owned the land the bars sat on, the supply lines for the liquor, and often the local sheriff. They hired their own private security forces, armies of regulators, who were often better armed and better paid than the U.S. Marshals. They used their saloon fortunes to buy political influence, ensuring that no reform laws would ever touch their profits. In a world where women couldn't even vote, these saloon owners were the most powerful people in the territory. Number 19. James Earp's Saloon, the Lawman's Secret. The Earp brothers, Wyatt, Virgil, Morgan, and James, are the ultimate icons of Western law and order. But the uncensored history reveals a much more complicated picture. Before the OK Corral, James Earp operated a saloon in Peoria, Illinois, and later in Tombstone. His business model was a classic example of the underground economy. The saloon served as a front for a brothel managed by his wife, Bessie. In many ways, the Earps were the precursors to organized crime families. They used their badges to protect their business interests and eliminate their competition. This shows that the line between lawman and outlaw was incredibly thin, and the saloon was the place where those two worlds merged into one. Number 18. Pearl de Vere's Luxury, the high-end frontier. While the average saloon was a place of grime, the old homestead in Cripple Creek, run by the legendary Pearl de Vere, was a vision of the future. Pearl understood that the New West wanted luxury. Her establishment featured the first electric lights in the area, indoor plumbing, a miracle at the time, and plush carpets imported directly from Europe. She maintained a strict dress code. If you weren't wearing a coat and tie, you weren't getting in. She charged $50 to $100 just for the privilege of entering, at a time when a laborer made $1 a day. This highlights the massive wealth inequality of the West. While one man was dying of rotgut in a cellar, another was sipping chilled French wine in a palace built on gold. Number 17. Cowboys Band, the class warfare of the bar. One of the greatest contradictions to the cowboy movie is the fact that many of the most successful saloons wouldn't let cowboys through the door. High-end establishments in cities like Denver or San Francisco had strict no-cowboy policies. Why? Because cowboys were the blue-collar laborers of their day. They were often dirty, smelled of cattle, and had a reputation for being rowdy and broke. Business owners much preferred the dandies, that is, the merchants, the bankers, and the mining magnates. These men drank expensive imported gin and champagne, smoked fine cigars, And, most importantly, they didn't get into fistfights that broke the mirrors. If you showed up in trail-worn leather and spurs, you were redirected to the bucket shops on the edge of town where the floors were dirt and the whiskey was battery acid. Number 16. Saloons as banks, the golden trust. In the early days of a gold rush, there were no banks, there were no vaults. There was only the saloon keeper's safe. Miners coming in from the claims would bring bags of raw gold dust, often their entire life's work, and hand them over to the bartender. The owner would weigh the dust, log it in a ledger, and place it in his safe. In return, the saloon would issue scrip, or IOUs. These pieces of paper became the local currency. You could buy groceries with a saloon IOU because everyone trusted the saloon owner's gold supply. This gave the saloon keeper an almost godlike status. If he was honest, the town prospered. If he was a gambler or a thief, he could disappear in the night with the entire town's wealth. The financial power of the saloon was the foundation of the frontier economy. Now, if you think the saloon was just about drinking and gambling, you're missing the bigger picture. Because coming up, we're getting into something most history books barely mention: how these places quietly controlled money, information, and even people's lives. And once you see it, you'll never look at the Wild West the same way again. Number 15. Interrupted services, when heaven met hell. Because saloons were often the only community spaces, itinerant preachers would sometimes attempt to hold Sunday services inside them. As you can imagine, the results were often explosive. One documented account from a mining camp in Colorado describes a preacher attempting to deliver a sermon on the evils of drink while standing on a whiskey barrel. The miners, rather than listening, began a contest to see who could shoot the heels off the preacher's boots without hitting his feet. In another instance, a group of cowboys began firing into the ceiling to see if the preacher could pray faster than the lead. This constant friction between the emerging civilized society and the fading lawless frontier was the daily reality of the saloon. Number 14. Rescue missions, the Underground Railroad of the West. In response to the exploitation of women in saloon-affiliated brothels, religious and social reform groups established rescue missions. These were often located directly next door to the most infamous saloons. These missions acted as a 19th century version of a witness protection program or a domestic violence shelter. They provided a physical escape route for women who were being held in debt slavery by owners like Al Swearingen. They offered literacy classes, sewing lessons, and safe passage back to the East. For many, the mission was the only thing standing between them and a shallow grave in a potter's field. It shows that even in the Wild West, there was a quiet, desperate effort to provide a safety net for the vulnerable. Number 13. The anti-saloon movement, the war for the soul of the West. As the 19th century drew to a close, a massive cultural war began to brew. The chaos, the broken families, and the violence stemming from saloon culture sparked a fierce backlash. This was the birth of the Anti-Saloon League and the Woman's Christian Temperance Union, or WCTU. This wasn't just about moral posturing. For the women of the frontier, the saloon was the enemy. It was the place where their husbands spent the rent money and came home violent. Activists like Carrie Nation became famous for walking into saloons with a hatchet and literally smashing the bars to splinters. This movement wasn't just a fringe group. It became one of the most powerful political forces in American history, eventually leading to the total prohibition of alcohol in 1920. Number 12. Rigged games, the Faro trap. If you stepped into a saloon to gamble, you were almost certainly going to lose. While poker is the game we associate with the West today, the real king of the saloon was a game called Faro. It was fast, it was easy to play, and it was incredibly easy to rig. Dealers used advantage decks with subtle markings or shaved edges that only they could feel. They used specialized dealing boxes with hidden springs that allowed them to pull 2 cards at once or hold back a specific card. The house edge in these saloons wasn't based on math, it was based on mechanical deception. A common saying of the time was, "A man who plays faro is a fool, a man who doesn't is a bigger one." People knew the games were rigged, But in a world with no other entertainment, they paid the tax, just for the excitement of the game. Number 11. The broke cowboy, the cycle of debt. The romantic image of the roaming, independent cowboy is one of the most persistent myths of the American West. In reality, most cowboys were the 19th century equivalent of seasonal, low-wage laborers. They worked grueling, dangerous jobs for months on end, only to receive their meager paycheck at the end of a cattle drive. The saloon was designed specifically to extract that paycheck as quickly as possible. Between the overpriced rotgut, the rigged gambling tables, and the entertainment fees, a cowboy could and often did spend 4 months' worth of wages in a single weekend. Many accounts describe cowboys leaving town on Monday morning, hungover and penniless, forced to head back to the ranch and sign another contract just to survive. The saloon wasn't a playground, it was a debt trap. Number 10. The poison, the horror of rotgut whiskey. When a cowboy walked up to a bar and asked for whiskey, he wasn't usually getting aged Kentucky bourbon. In the remote frontier, real liquor was expensive and hard to transport. Unscrupulous bartenders created their own house blends to maximize profit. They would take a small amount of real alcohol and stretch it with raw grain spirits. To give it the proper amber color, they added tobacco juice or burnt sugar. For that authentic burn, they would add ginger, pepper, or, in more sinister cases, strychnine, battery acid, or turpentine. This wasn't just hyperbole. This stuff was literally poisonous. Known as rotgut, snake oil, or coffin varnish, this concoction caused permanent nerve damage, blindness, and extreme irrational aggression. Many of the wild behaviors attributed to the frontier were likely the result of mass chemical poisoning from the very drinks men paid for. Number 9. Filthy realities, the biohazard of sawdust. If you could travel back in time to an 1880s saloon, the first thing that would hit you, besides the smell, is the floor. Modern bars are cleaned with industrial disinfectants. Old West saloons used sawdust, but the sawdust wasn't there for aesthetics. It was there to manage a literal biohazard. In an era where everyone chewed tobacco, the floor was a lake of brown spit. Men would lean over the bar and expector it directly onto the ground. Add to that spilled beer, mud, animal waste tracked in from the street, and the occasional pool of blood from a scuffle, and you have a recipe for disaster. The sawdust was meant to soak up the liquid so it could be swept out at the end of the week. It was a breeding ground for tuberculosis, cholera, and pneumonia, making the saloon floor one of the most dangerous places in town, even without a gun in sight. Number 8. Racial segregation, the harsh divide. While the Boston Saloon was a beacon of success, it was a rare exception. The reality for most minorities in the West was one of strict and often violent segregation. Most mainstream saloons were for white patrons only. This led to the creation of segregated districts like Chinatown in San Francisco or Little Mexico pockets in Texas. These minority-run saloons weren't just places to drink. They were survival hubs. They were places where immigrants could speak their native languages, find housing, and protect one another from the predatory nativist gangs that patrolled the streets. This fragmentation created a hidden map of the West, a series of underground economies that functioned entirely parallel to the official record. Number 7. The Boston Saloon, rediscovering hidden history. History is often written by the victors, and for a long time, the history of the West was scrubbed of its diversity. However, modern archaeology is bringing the uncensored truth to light. One of the most significant finds was the Boston Saloon in Virginia City, Nevada. Discovered during an excavation, the Boston Saloon was a high-end establishment owned by a black businessman named William A.G. Brown. While many saloons were dirt-floored shacks, the Boston Saloon featured fine crystal stemware, expensive cuts of lamb and beef, and top-shelf liquors. It served as a sophisticated social club for the black community during the Silver Boom. This discovery shatters the myth that the West was a monolithic white space and proves that despite the era's crushing racism, minority entrepreneurs created spaces of immense luxury and influence that were often superior to their white-owned counterparts. Stories like that really change how you see the Wild West. If you enjoy real stories like this, consider subscribing. There's a lot more coming. Number 6. The Long Branch, The saloon as government center. We often think of the separation of church and state, or bar and state. But in the Old West, those lines were non-existent. In many fledgling towns, the saloon was the only sturdy, large building available. This meant that the famous Long Branch Saloon in Dodge City functioned as much more than a drinking hole. It was the town's courthouse. It was the election center. It was the town hall. Imagine a scenario where a judge is presiding over a horse thievery trial in the morning on the same table where a high-stakes poker game had resulted in a stabbing just hours before. The saloon was the civic heart of the community. This created a bizarre atmosphere where the law was literally being debated in the presence of the very vices it was trying to regulate. In the West, justice wasn't blind. It was usually just a little bit drunk. Number 5. The Gem Theater, a city within a city. In the lawless town of Deadwood, the Gem Theater represented the absolute peak, or perhaps the absolute rock bottom of saloon evolution. Owned by the notorious Al Swearingen, the Gem wasn't just a place to grab a beer. It was a massive, vertically integrated criminal empire. Swearingen was a pioneer of exploitation. He would send recruiters to the East Coast to find young women, promising them glamorous acting jobs in his theater. When these women arrived after an exhausting journey, they found a grim reality. The theater was a front for a brothel and a gambling den. They were trapped, often in debt to Swearingen for their travel costs, and forced into a life of misery. The Gem operated 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, bringing in an average of $5,000 to $1,000 a night, a staggering fortune in the 1870s. It was an early, brutal version of a casino empire, built on the backs of those who had no way out. Number 4. Information networks, the 19th century Internet. Long before Reddit, Twitter, or even a reliable postal service, there was the saloon bar. This was the undisputed information hub of the frontier. If you were a drifter looking for work, you didn't look for a help wanted sign, you asked the bartender. Saloon owners often acted as informal postmasters. If a letter was addressed to a miner in the hills, it was left behind the bar. If a gold strike happened 3 towns over, the news broke at the saloon first. They were the news editors of their era, curating what information was shared and with whom. This gave the saloon keeper an incredible amount of leverage. Knowledge was the most valuable currency in the West, and the man who poured the drinks was the one who controlled the flow of information. Number 3. The Hollywood lie, violence versus the boring reality. If you believe the movies, a trip to a saloon meant dodging bullets every 10 minutes. If you looked at a man the wrong way, a duel broke out. However, historical records and police ledgers from famous cattle towns like Dodge City, Abilene, and Wichita tell a much different story. Statistically, total gunfights were surprisingly rare. Why? Because saloon owners hated them. A shootout meant broken mirrors, which were incredibly expensive to transport across the desert. Most days in a saloon were characterized by oppressive heat, flies, and overwhelming boredom. The violence that did occur wasn't the choreographed, honorable duel we see on screen. It was clumsy, drunken, and pathetic. It was 2 men who could barely stand, fumbling with heavy revolvers that often misfired, eventually resulting in a chaotic scuffle on a dirty floor. The fastest gun in the West trope was largely a creation of dime novels and, later, Hollywood. Real frontier life was a slow grind of survival, punctuated by very brief, very messy bursts of panic. Number 2. The Great Deception, the myth of the bat-wing doors. In every classic Western film, the protagonist makes his grand entrance by kicking open a pair of waist-high swinging doors. It's a moment of pure drama. But in the real 1870s, those doors, properly known as cafe doors or bat-wing doors, were purely a matter of grim functionality. First, let's talk about the smell. A 19th century saloon was a pungent, windowless box. It was filled with the stench of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco smoke, cheap coal oil lamps, and the metallic tang of spilled blood and beer. Without windows, these saloons would have been literal gas chambers. The batwing doors allowed for constant airflow at the bottom and top while keeping the center obscured. Secondly, they were a tool for social hypocrisy. The respectable citizens of the town, the preachers, the school teachers, and the temperance-minded wives did not want to see the debauchery happening inside. The doors were tall enough to hide the faces of the men drinking away their family's savings, but short enough to let the cool night air circulate. They weren't designed for dramatic entrances. They were designed to hide the shame of the community from itself. Number 1. Saloons as centers of deadly disease. To understand the Wild West, you have to look past the gunsmoke and realize that the saloon was actually a lethal biological crossroads. While Hollywood focuses on the threat of a quick draw, historical reality reveals that saloons were the primary breeding grounds for the era's most terrifying killers: cholera, tuberculosis, and smallpox. These establishments were a perfect storm of biological hazards. In a world where frontier sanitation systems didn't exist and personal hygiene was a luxury few could afford, the saloon acted as a central exchange for pathogens. The conditions inside were a nightmare for public health. Men tracked animal waste and street filth directly into the sawdust-covered floors, while shared drinking glasses and communal towels became rapid transit systems for infection. Pests like lice, fleas, and flies thrived in the dark, damp corners, moving from one patron to another in seconds. Because the saloon was the only community hub, it meant that an outbreak in one mining camp could paralyze an entire territory within weeks. The uncensored truth is that the man standing next to you at the bar wasn't likely to kill you with a revolver. He was far more likely to kill you with a cough. The Wild West wasn't a movie. It was a brutal, fascinating, and deeply human struggle for survival in a world where the only rule was that there were no rules. We look back at these legends of the frontier and see heroes, but the truth is buried under layers of rotgut whiskey and the literal grime of history. The saloon was the crucible of the American spirit, a place where the desperate and the daring met to build a new world, often at a terrible cost. It was a landscape of extreme contrast where a man could lose his life's savings in a rigged game of faro or die from a shared glass of water before he ever had the chance to draw his pistol. This era represents the raw, unfiltered birth of the American identity, one defined by grit, shadow, and an uncompromising will to endure. These stories remind us that the past is rarely as clean as the history books suggest, and that the real wild in the West wasn't just the lawlessness, but the sheer messy reality of human nature pushed to its absolute limit. If you're ready to stop watching the sanitized version of history and start uncovering the grit that the textbooks are too afraid to print, make sure you smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We are on a mission to exhume the most uncensored accounts of the frontier, and you won't want to miss our next deep dive into the shadows of the past. Thanks for watching. Stay curious and keep it wild.